Hey, preaching brothers, are we preaching God's ideas, or are we only preaching our own ideas dressed up in God's words? There's a big difference, and we need to talk about that difference. Ministry matters, preaching ministry matters particularly. Welcome back, everybody. It's good to see you. Listen, there's something that I really want to talk to you about today. For the last 3 years or so, my wife and I have been traveling around the United States. We've seen some wonderful places, and we've worshiped with some great congregations. We've worshiped with some struggling congregations. We've listened to some really good preaching. We've listened to some really poor preaching. But the poor preaching is not poor because it's dull or uninteresting. There's a much more fundamental point involved. Apparently, there are two broad ways of coming up with sermons. One goes like this: hey, I've got an idea. It's a good idea. It may even be a biblical idea. But now that I've got my idea, I'm going to run around through the Bible and find passages to prove that God agrees with me in this really good idea. That is not biblical preaching. Another trend is for the individual to say, God has an idea. Let's see if I can somehow understand this idea and explain it so that other people can understand it and apply it to their lives. That's biblical preaching, but I promise you, it's much harder work. It requires a few things from us. First of all, it requires that we understand something of the world in which these words are given to us in the first place. We have to hear it like the original hearers did, as much as we are able to do that. Second, we need to look at the overall context of this passage that we are examining. We need to think about the general theme, the whole idea that God is communicating in this passage. We need to see how the passage that we plan to preach fits in with the larger section and maybe even the entire book itself that we intend to work with. We need to see any important markers in that passage. Anything that makes us say, that's interesting, is probably something that we want to explore a little bit. And we need to notice the central point that is being communicated here by God and any subpoints that are involved in that communication as well. Now, once we've done all that background work, then we need to know this all well enough to present it clearly and engagingly. That's where the real hard work of preaching begins. Preaching is amazingly individualistic and creative. There are many, many ways to do this, but good preaching, biblical preaching, always starts with the passage. It starts with God's idea, and then we listen to what God has to explain to us. Now, I gave you a little bit of theory there. Theory, I think, is kind of hard to follow sometimes. So let's take a passage that we're going to deal with, and then we will break this down and talk about these individual parts as we get into this. I want you to go with me to Matthew chapter 12. While you're doing that, I'm going to take a brief break, and then I'll be right back, and we're going to go in through Matthew chapter 12 and just deal with a very short section near the end of the chapter, verses 33 to 37. And I think you'll be impressed with how this comes about. All right, we're back. We've got a Bible. We're going to build a sermon outline. Well, okay, a bare bones sort of sermon outline that deals with Matthew chapter 12, beginning in verse 33 and running down through verse 37. Now, there are a lot of ways to do this. And as I said, preaching is individualistic and it's very creative. The first thing that we want to notice, however, is this incident actually starts back up here in verse 22. Then they brought him a man who was demon-possessed. That's where the incident really begins. And so we see that he is blind and mute. Jesus healed him. The people were astonished and said, "Could this be the son of David?" Pharisees heard. They said, "It's only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that the fellow drives out demons." From the very beginning, as we said, you want to know something about the world into which these words first came and how these people would hear this. That means we're going to have to know some things about what son of David meant. And we're going to need to know something about Beelzebub, and we're probably going to need to know a lot about Pharisees and why they would oppose Jesus. Why would Pharisees oppose Jesus? All of that information we need in our background as we begin to make sense of this passage. Then we need to think about the whole general context and the theme as Jesus begins in verse 25, knowing their thoughts, and said to them, and he begins to respond to their criticism of him. So that whole rest of this from verse 25 down through verse 37 has to do with Jesus responding to this opposition that he gets from the Pharisees. But I really want to focus on verse 33 to 37. Usually, when we get near the end of a story or the incident, that's when the most important teaching occurs. It's kind of like the setup of a joke. You've got a setup, you've got a character or characters, you've got a place, situation going on, but it all leads up to the punchline. The punchline is the important part. So in this incident, as Jesus deals with these Pharisees, he's trying to talk to them and make sense to them in some general common sense, but he really gets down to the heart of the matter right at the very end, beginning in verse 33. So one of the things that I said is we want to see the overall theme, and then we want to see the main point and some sub-points here. Let me wait on the main point just for a minute. Let's just go through these verses and see what the subpoints are that Jesus is making in this passage from verse 33 down through verse 37. Beginning in verse 33, the very first subpoint that we see is that production happens according to nature. And that's the way it's always been. Verse 33, make a tree good, Jesus says, and its fruit will be good. Or make a tree bad, and its fruit will be bad, for a tree is recognized by its fruit. This is just kind of a common sense proverbial statement. Everyone would recognize that Jesus is telling the truth here. It's been that way since creation. Production always happens according to nature. The next sub-point that Jesus makes is the same thing is true of people as is true of trees. So we start in verse 34, you brood of vipers. Jesus can describe them that way. How can you who are evil say anything good? For out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. The good man brings good things out of the good stored up in him, and the evil man brings evil things out of the evil stored in him. What is true of trees is true of people. It's just a general idea that is obviously true. And if it is true of trees, it's true of people. And Jesus knows that the people are going to acknowledge that and accept his word on that. So the first subpoint is production is according to nature. The second subpoint is it's true of people as well as of trees. The third subpoint is in these last two verses, and that's where we really want to get to, because what Jesus says is we will answer for the production of our hearts. But I tell you, he says, beginning in verse 36, but I tell you that men will have to give account on the day of judgment for every careless word they have spoken. For by your words you will be acquitted, and by your words you will be condemned. The point there is that we will be judged based on what we really are. And if you could encapsulate the entire message of this section in one sentence, that would be it. We will be judged based on what we actually are. Now, an application of this, to bring this home to people's lives, which is very important. You don't want to just leave this as an ancient history lesson. You have to apply this to people's lives. So one of the things that they need to know is we must be changed at our hearts to be good people. We have to be changed right at the center of who we are in order to be good people. Now, that's in some ways very fortunate because it is Christ who changes hearts, and we are so grateful that that is the case. Now, I need to say about this sermon idea, first of all, this is not the only way this passage could be preached. This is one way. And I think it is a biblical way that describes correctly what's happening within the passage. It is a biblical approach because it's based on Jesus's idea and not just some good idea that I might or might not have. See, it's very important that we preach according to the Word of God, that we build our sermons based on God's ideas and not ours. See, preaching matters when preaching brings God's ideas from the page into lives. And that's when ministry really matters. I hope this has been a little bit helpful in just describing the difference between thinking I have a good idea and now I'll just run around find passages to illustrate my good ideas, versus taking the passage and preaching the passage from God's idea, because it really does matter that we tell the truth and we tell it biblically. God bless you for preaching. I hope this is of some help to you in constructing biblical sermons. And as always, folks, like, subscribe, and share if someone can use this video, because ministry matters. God bless you.